It's very hard to change your culture. So if you have a strategy that isn't aligned to your culture, it's not going to work.
I've thought a lot about culture, and I think the conclusion I've reached is I used to at one point talk about good and bad cultures. I don't do that anymore. I talk about strong and weak cultures because every organization's strategy and the industry they're in and the competitive dynamics they're in, what Drucker called the theory of the business, and then the choice of strategy then dictates the type of culture that we want to have.
Hi, I'm Matt Egol, host of the CX and Culture Connection, the podcast for leaders looking to drive impact by focusing on customer experience and culture together. I'm excited to have Professor Bernie Jaworski on the podcast today. Bernie is the Peter F. Drucker Chair in Management at Claremont Graduate University. He is co-author of Creating the Organization of the Future, together with Virginia Chung, Associate Professor at Chechen University, who holds a PhD from Claremont. Thanks for being on the podcast, Bernie.
Happy to be here, Matt. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed your book, Creating the Organization of the Future, which I understand you have another book coming out shortly that you can tell us about. But I really enjoyed doing the review, which people can find on the JourneySpark website and the books on Amazon. Um, the book's about why the teachings of Drucker and Confucius go well together. Uh, what are some of the themes from the book that you think will resonate most with the leaders looking to accelerate growth through more customer-driven cultures?
Yeah, it kind of seems like there's two ideas here that should not fit together, Confucianism and Peter Drucker, right? Because Confucianism was back before organizations even existed. And as you know, Drucker's the father of modern management, who's all about organizations. Where they intersect is they're both concerned about functioning society. They were concerned about individual achievement and giving individuals the promise to live in society in a way that benefits both the individual as well as society. And the idea of being human centered, the idea of focusing on the role of the human being in terms of their ethics, their integrity, how it is they approach things, types of lives they live, were the same. Were the same in some core level, even though the writing was such a distant period between the two writers. But I think the overlap, to be really clear, was discovered by my student Virginia Chung, who was my PhD student several years ago, and so this was the catalyst for the book and how we got started down this journey.
No, I didn't know the connection before reading the book. It works though. I mean, it's hats off. I hadn't expected that connection to be so strong, and I've always been a fan of Drucker's work, and I'm happy to share some personal reasons why that was meaningful to me. Um, and I'm sure there's a lot of personal connection for you to fill that chair, so to speak, and you can share more with the audience about that's a literal interpretation to fill the chair. We were just talking about that.
So the Peter Drucker Chair, as many endowed chairs, are sponsored by some external organization that gives a fair amount of money to endow a chair on behalf of typically the organization. In this case, it was Peter Drucker. It was actually Edward Jones, the company who we consulted with for 30 years, who funded the underlying chair. And the chair was targeted for a scholar who was able to work with both practice and theory. And so they spent actually a few years looking for someone to fit the bill. And fortunately, they found me, and fortunately, things worked out. So I literally moved into Peter Drucker's office and literally sit in his chair. So that's the literal interpretation. It's not the way people typically think about endowed chair positions, but in this case, it came with a chair.
That's a great personal story. My own story, not quite as direct interaction with Drucker himself, but it's meaningful to me, is my father, um, who was a partner at Arthur Anderson, and was involved in a number of efforts there around their School of the Future, and also kind of a new approach to managerial accounting that was based more on systems thinking. And so he wrote a few books, and he was a real big influence on my own thinking. And he consulted with Drucker. So he always used to like say, "Oh, I just talked to Peter Drucker about this," and he was really motivated and energized by that. So I never got to meet Drucker, but live vicariously through my dad.
It's interesting. Drucker would always consult on his own as a single individual, never as part of anybody else. And lots of times he had people come visit him at his home. And so there's great stories around Drucker entertaining folks like Jack Welch, where he would sit with him all day in his very modest home in Claremont. And then his wife would make a meatball or meatloaf dinner, and they would have it at the kitchen table, which is, again, very, very modest. So I can imagine these titans of industries sitting in a house that was probably 1,600 square feet and in a very simple neighborhood. And he lived a very modest sort of lifestyle. But he had such a massive impact on the world in terms of how to define, literally his book, the 1954 book called Practice of Management, literally defined the field of management. So it's an amazing history of knowledge production, much like Confucianism in a whole different era, right?
I guess to bring it back to the linkage with Confucius, one of the things that you mentioned earlier in our conversation is they both cared about a functioning society. And, that was in Confucius about living a virtuous life and practicing the right rituals and mentoring and helping teach the master teacher relationship and teaching others to be good leaders and live the right virtues. And Drucker was also very concerned with leadership and really empowering individuals. That's where my father was consulting with him, was about how do you create an intrinsically motivated organization where people really live the values of the organization.
It's an amazing story, right? When I first started reading Drucker's work, and I teach a course actually at Drucker called The Philosophy of Peter Drucker, which is every MBA student has to take, whether they like it or not. But I think most enjoy it. I realized after reading his books and thinking very carefully about, I've never met the man, but reading his books and thinking very carefully about what he was writing about, is that even though he's called the father of modern management, the reality is his fundamental concern was functioning society. And for societies to function well, they had to have organizations, nonprofit, for profit, and other types, all function well. And for them to function well, they had to have the right leadership and right management practice. So honestly, I think what happened, and we don't have him here to tell us this, but I think what happened is he started with functioning society, and as a result moved into organizations management leadership, as opposed to, I'm the father of modern management, I have a point of view about how society can improve. I think it's the reverse. When you read all of his work, it's very easy for me to convince myself that he was concerned about functioning society first and then organizational life second.
So it's interesting. You've got me thinking now about Adam Smith, who was a philosopher who then became one of the most renowned economists.
Yeah, and Drucker always, one of the quotes I love, and actually my chair is titled the Peter F. Drucker Chair of Management and Liberal Arts. And Drucker believed that management fundamentally was a liberal art. He felt to address the important problems of organizations and of society, you had to take a very broad perspective. And if you read his work carefully, he draws from literature, he draws from history, he draws from psychology, he draws a lot from economics, he draws from political science. He comes at it from so many different angles to address the issue that's at hand. And it's rare to see someone with that breadth of knowledge that can kind of pull interesting stories that support his argument that he's making around whatever issue it might be.
I think that's really powerful. As personally, I've always valued collaboration and multidisciplinary thinking, and that you can learn from other people, and that you're always trying to connect different ideas together to make things more impactful. And what you're saying really resonates with me around, bringing together, different, like in liberal arts. That's why I valued my own liberal arts education, was studying anthropology, psychology, economics, political philosophy. All of them have had a huge impact on my own thinking, which is I think of myself as a student of behavior, both human behavior, both at an individual consumer level and organizational.
Well, I mean, I know you're particularly interested in culture, right? And that's an interesting cut-in point because Drucker called that the esprit de corps in his very early work. The word culture didn't exist at that point. It existed, obviously, in anthropology and other areas, but it didn't exist in organizations. So he labeled it esprit de corps. And it was something about, what is it about when you put an organization together where you get much more than the sum of its parts? And so he had a very strong point of view around kind of culture.
Bernie, you've talked a lot in the book and in our conversation about how important being human-centered is and taking more of a broader liberal arts perspective. And how has that, influenced your own work, and also how have you picked it up in the book?
So Drucker has this fascinating idea, and he calls it management by objectives. And what people typically think of is management, command and control, sets the objectives, and then individuals just are there to execute. It's actually the exact opposite of that. Drucker basically says every individual in the organization needs to understand the mission, and then they need to ask themselves the question of, what do I do to contribute to the mission? And from there, they then say, if this is my role, what are the specific responsibilities I want to have this year? And what are my two or three goals? They initiate the conversation with their boss. And then ultimately they agree upon, yeah, these are the 2 to 3 goals that you have this year, whatever they may be. So there may be some compromise along the way, but they agree these are the 2 to 3 goals. Now, those goals are not just to help the organization deliver on what they need to deliver, but the individuals also is developing themselves along the way. And Drucker had a point of view that said the most powerful form of control in an organization is self control. So the notion is once I align myself with the overall mission and we agree these are the goals, then it's my responsibility, my accountability to step up and deliver those goals. And if I need help from you, I need information, I need support, I look to you. But he had a belief that individuals would have the best chance of being productive and the best chance of moving beyond common things and doing uncommon things if they unleash the full potential of that individual. And by me agreeing upon the goals and helping set the goals, I'm going to be actually aligning with what I need to do, how I need to develop, leverage my strengths, and try and meet the overall goals of the organization. But at the same time, give myself the opportunity to also develop and learn along the way.
For me, this is part of what fuses the kind of connection of culture with other things, because culture is about mindsets and behaviors and relationship networks and skills. Those are often viewed as the four building blocks of culture, which drives how things are done around here, or the ethos, as you said. So cultures, you know, um, is key to translate your mission, vision, purpose, and values into behaviors. And that ultimately, if you don't have clarity on the behaviors, then you're fighting your culture. And that's why Drucker's often misquoted as saying culture eats strategy for breakfast. He actually said something else.
Matt, it's so funny. Most people attribute that quote to him, and we've never ever seen that quote in all of his work, number one. And number two is if you read his work very carefully, it doesn't sound like him.
Mhm.
It just doesn't sound like him. He is so precise and articulate about how he uses terms that that phrase is too loose, too colloquial in terms of its orientation. It just doesn't make sense that it sounds like Drucker. So it's good that you discovered that because the answer is he never said that. So does he think culture is important? He thinks it's absolutely essential, right? And I can talk about that issue, but the point is, yeah, it's very, very, very important. But he didn't have that particular phrase.
Yeah, I did some research when I was writing my own book, The CX and Culture Connection, because I was thinking of I had some quotes sprinkled throughout the books, and I wanted to open with the book with that quote. Because I'm a strategist by background, started at Arthur D. Little after college, then Booz and Company, then Booz was acquired by PwC later. I know you worked at Monitor, so um, and then I adopted later a significant focus on culture in the work that I did for a number of reasons. But I love that quote, and I realized it wasn't from him, and I started researching it, and I found this Wall Street Journal article that he wrote, and a lot of people use that as the etymology, the origin of this phrase, where he said, culture, no matter how defined, is singularly persistent, in which he meant it's very hard to change it. And it was in the context that if you fight your culture, it's very hard to change your culture. So if you have a strategy that isn't aligned to your culture, it's not going to work.
And it's very well stated. It's funny. I've thought a lot about culture, and I think the conclusion I've reached is I used to at one point talk about good and bad cultures. I don't do that anymore. I talk about strong and weak cultures because every organization's strategy and the industry that are in and the competitive dynamics that are in, what Drucker called the theory of the business, and then the choice of strategy, then dictates the type of culture that we want to have. And so culture for one company could be, so, good example of this, right? Costco is a very family oriented culture, and that works perfectly for Costco and its culture. And you see people when you walk into Costco that take responsibility really in a way that looking after others and so forth. Netflix, exact opposite. Netflix says we do not want to be a family. It's the last thing we want to do. We're a sports team. We're here to win. We're competitive. We're, blah, blah, blah. So completely different cultures. Now, is one better or worse? Are they both strong cultures? They're both strong cultures, right? And so what you want is a strong culture, and that supports the strategy, the orientation, the competitive dynamics are unfolding, right? So I've now changed my terminology, and I don't have a judgment as to whether one's good or bad. It's basically strong or weak, and you want one that's strong, right?
One thing I learned in the kind of through the Katzenbach Center and my teaming with other people, at Booz and PwC. The Katzenbach Center was like a think tank within Booz that was named after John Katzenbach, who wrote The Wisdom of Teams and 20 other books. And I had the privilege of working with him and team members from the Katzenbach Center, and I became kind of the customer experience and digital transformation guy connected with culture. And a lot of that was because working on helping organizations embrace digital required focusing a lot on the behaviors in the organization. Like, how do you actually get a company that's bigger to behave more like a startup? How do you get a company to embrace new ways of working that drive a significant change in the organization without addressing culture? You're going to fail. So that's how my interest evolved. In culture, and they always said that you focus on behaviors, and there's both good and bad behaviors in an organization, and that um, you have to acknowledge there's always going to be both good and bad behavior in an organization. And what you want to do is increase the good behaviors to make them more like habits, and that you don't go about suppressing bad behavior. You go about reinforcing good behavior. And a lot of what resonated for me with your book was actually that both Drucker and Confucius really focused on a system of behavior that became rituals and ways to drive adoption of behavior in an organization in a way that it's not just driven from the top down. There's a role for that, but that you want people to feel motivated to drive behaviors and adopt them themselves.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it is about behavior, and what's the source of behavior, what's the trigger behavior, what's the causal agent behind behavior. It's interesting to ask, but it is about behavior at the end of the day, and I'm completely on the same page. On a completely different topic, one of the things that research I did a lot in the '90s and early 2000 was on what does it mean to be a market-driven company. And the end of all that research is we basically concluded that you got to really look at the behaviors of the organization, and in particular, three types. Are they generating the right type of intelligence, market intelligence, customer intelligence? Are they second behaviors? Are they sharing it, bringing it back, and reaching conclusions about it? And third is, are they acting on it? Are they making decisions around products, services, pricing, where to play, and so forth? And so, but the whole thing was behavior focused. We weren't looking at attitudes. We weren't looking at mindset. We're now not to say those aren't very important, but at the end of the day, we were looking at behaviors to diagnose how market driven a company would be.
hmm I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction for a minute, which is you got me thinking, Bernie, about how customer and employee experience go together and how you want your employees to be leaders. You want your leaders to help develop other employees, like you talked about with both Confucius and Drucker. And one of the mastermind groups that I'm leading with Tamar Cohen is focused on how to amplify your customer and employee experience together. Um, I have some other mastermind groups as well, but I'd love to cut in for a minute. We'll share a 1 minute reel about the mastermind groups, and then we'll continue the conversation on the other side about this employee connection. Allow me to briefly interrupt the podcast to share an invitation for you to join one of our mastermind groups. These groups are for leaders building out the CX function at their organization. They are for culture champions looking to develop and sustain behaviors that bring their organization's mission, vision, purpose, and values to life. I'm excited to team with Randy Rothenberg, former CEO of the IAB, on a mastermind group focused on experience as a winning marketing strategy. I'm teaming with Tamar Cohen, who has led CX and EX teams at Zoetis and Travelers, on another group focused on CX EX alignment, and with Greg Kihlstrom, host of the Agile Brand podcast, on a group focused on building a self-funding growth flywheel. Each group meets monthly for 90 minutes. Members receive a coaching hour each month and can attend quarterly workshops. Go to JourneySpark's website for more information. Please DM me on LinkedIn with any questions. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Bernie, I love the focus on employee empowerment and on motivation of employees and them being self-directed to develop their goals and align it to the mission, vision, purpose of the organization. How do you think about this connection of CX and EX in your research and your work?
So actually, it's very funny, Matt. I'm going to take us back in 3 decades when I was first starting out my research program. And one of the things that we did empirically was to take a look at what do sort of market driven companies that really practice those three behaviors of generating intelligence and using it, are they actually higher performing than companies that don't do it? And the answer was, yeah, they are. Okay, that's obvious. The second thing, which is probably obvious, is gee whiz, do they have more satisfied, loyal, happy customers? As a result of being kind of market driven. The answer is, yeah, they are. The interesting side effect, the thing that we didn't expect, the thing that at the time, again, this is decades ago, was is it the case that you can show that market driven companies that really pay attention are actually also driving employee satisfaction, employee happiness, employee engagement? And the answer is yeah, they are. So there's an interplay between the two of them. That is, when you have really satisfied, happy, loyal customers, it's highly driving the employee satisfaction, engagement, loyalty. And employee satisfaction, engagement, loyalty, in turn, has a double loop back effect on customers. So they're both driving each other. And you can see, so short answer is when you have really satisfied, highly engaged employees and can't be happier, you're going to have all else equal, happy and loyal and satisfied customers. That's kind of the show. That's the answer. Highly correlated. Now, that stated, the interesting question at some level is the off diagonal. What companies have really happy employees and dissatisfied customers? And which companies out there floating around have really happy customers and dissatisfied employees? So those are crazily interesting research questions, but the general correlation is there. The linear correlation between employee engagement, happiness, and so forth, and customer satisfaction has been empirically shown in the academic literature in our best, most scholarly academic journals.
You know, um, Despite the evidence, and there's a lot of evidence out there that you're citing, a lot of companies still manage customer and employee experiences, very distinct disciplines. And there are, for example, when customer experience, a lot of companies focus on moments that matter for the customer and they map out the journey and they use design thinking and all the tools that are great to improve customer experience. And if they're good at that, they will take into account the employees as personas that impact the customer journey. But that's a customer experience led lens that often is independent from the other HR initiatives at the company around them, which are more of EX. So the employee experience tends to focus on the engagement survey, on the onboarding experience. And then there's a hire to retire journey for the employee that is separate as a journey, and you can apply the same repertoire of tools and design thinking and customer listening and quality management to the employee experience. But what's really powerful is to actually bring them together, because very often Danny Meyer says, put people first, the founder of Shake Shack and a number of very successful restaurants for the Danny Meyer group. And then Will Guidara was his mentee, and he wrote the book Unreasonable Hospitality recently. I did a book review of Will's book. They both were keynote speakers at Qualtrics and Medallia this year. So this year was like the year of humanity and putting people first, and interesting at both conferences. But what you're talking about is putting people first is good for customer experience, and you can explicitly approach them together rather than view them as separate disciplines.
It's a really interesting observation, Matt. And you nailed it, and that's exactly the way it's been done. Lots of effort, customer journey mapping, pain points mapping, all that stuff, right? And then over here on the employee, it's the engagement survey, and if we're not, but the idea of what are the employee pain points? What's their journey look like? What are it's the same tools should be applied if you're going to be human centered on both sides, but they're not. I think that's a really good observation, actually.
Tamar, who I mentioned, that we're doing the mastermind group together, and she was a guest on the podcast recently as well. She was at Citi and Zoetis and Travelers and CX and EX roles before launching her own firm, like I did, leaving PwC to launch my own firm, and we're enjoying collaborating. She really likes to focus on the employee experience as delivering the customer experience. And one of the things we focused on in our podcast together is how you can um, directly engage your employees and think about what's creating pain points for your employees on the journey. Often those things that are making life harder for them are also things that create uh, friction in the customer experience.
That's really interesting. Really, I'd love to see some of that work. I think that's a fascinating, and it makes some intuitive sense, right? In fact, the early literature in this area was something called the service profit chain. I remember this from Harvard Business School, that a number of guys, Len Schlesinger being one of them, as well as others. And basic argument was that they came up with this service profit chain that said, listen, the starting point is to hire really great employees. That's just the starting point, right? We'll train them for skills and everything else, but you got to hire people that have high integrity, have good work ethic, have the right values. Bam. If you do that, they're gonna design the right restaurant experience. They're gonna drive the right operations. They're gonna drive the right customer experience. They're gonna do all the operations correctly. And if you get the operations all down correctly, and you have a system to do it, a way of doing it, the machine's running well, you're gonna have happy and satisfied employees or customers. And those in turn, satisfied loyal customers in turn drive financial performance. So they had this chain of linkages across that they showed the correlations. They didn't show causality at the time, but but the intuition that it's the employees that drive the system, the operations, which in turn drive the customer experience, makes a great deal of sense. Therefore, the starting point for any great service organization is first, to your point earlier, get the people thing right. You know, and again, that's actually funny enough. That's also where the values kick in, right? Do I structured my values in the organization correctly so that I hire people to fit the values that I kind of want, right? From a cultural perspective, what are the right values that I want to have in place?
One of the things you write about in the book, Bernie, is that the mission, vision, and purpose needs to be more led from the top down. And you can be careful not to over involve too many people in shaping that. And you may want to communicate and engage people. It's like, the same thing often comes up in strategy is how broad a team do you want to have involved in shaping the strategy. But the mission, vision, and purpose, you're advocating as a narrower circle at the top, but that translating the values into behaviors needs to be a much broader set of people involved in the organization. Can you explain why to the audience?
Yeah, and that can be controversial, Matt. And I think one of the things you want to do in a book is be somewhat controversial, right? So if you're saying, one of these last things you want to do is read the book and say, "Hey, I knew all this before," so but it took me 300 pages to figure out that I know all this, right? So the controversy, just for some listeners, could be, why is it the case that we believe the mission, vision, and purpose need to be set by senior management? And this is going to take a few minutes to sort of explain this one, so I apologize up front. So the mission answers the question is, what business are we in? From the customer's perspective. The vision is what happens when we actually achieve that mission. What does the world look like? And the purpose is, how are we helping society function better? Okay. If you take someone like Mars Pet Care, their purpose is to make a better world for pets. And if you interact with anybody from Mars Pet Care, that owns a lot of the pet nutritional brands, owns a number of vet hospitals and so forth, you find people that speak that purpose all the time. And that purpose drives everything they do. And that purpose was arrived as a result of some very serious work about 8, 9 years ago from their C-level team. My personal view is these are very difficult choices to make in a collective, and that What you really want is the top of the house to kind of take responsibility for what the mission is. Now, Drucker argued, interesting enough, the mission has to be revisited on a constant basis. If you're in fast changing industries that are moving so quickly, you take someone like NVIDIA or something like that in the world of semiconductors. Back years ago when I was doing consulting work in the industry, they said, and it may be the case today, I'm not sure. They said the entire product life cycle is 3 months from the time of launch to the time the product was over. So, you got to be able to think very carefully about giving people that have deep, deep knowledge and deep expertise and are leaders of the company kind of the time to think through very, very carefully those statements. What business are we actually in? Now, it doesn't mean you can't get some input somewhere along the way, but not in a formal way. I'm perfectly fine with Nadella doing when he took over in Microsoft, doing town halls for several months to listen to people. But at the end of the day, Nadella is hired to make that decision, figure out what is the mission. And he did that, right? And that set the direction and course for where Microsoft is today, in my judgment. Right? Now, because these are significant and important questions, they take time. They take time to reflect on, take time to nurture. But that's what you hired that C-level team to do, is to figure out where do we want to go? What's now from that, if you really got a clear mission and really got a clear vision and you really a clear purpose, you're going to get followers. You're going to get people that say, I get that. I understand where they're going. I understand where they want to go. And then the question becomes, as a collective, I want people to sit back and think, all right, what culture do we need? What culture am I going to be part of? How am I going to shape the culture? How am I going to live the culture? Right? Drucker had a point of view that everybody's responsibility in the organization was, he called it live the values at the time, but you can think of this as the culture, that everybody had to live the culture. That's one of the performance ways that you judge people's performance in the years. Are they living the culture of the organization? Are they
Judge
kind of
them
doing
by their behaviors, their behavior congruent with the
judged by their
values. Yeah.
behavior? Right. And so you could see the translation, pretty directly of what's going on. But this collective sense of understanding the value, they have to own them, they have to live them, they have to believe them. The reason a talent joins an organization is because they want to be part of that culture, whatever that culture might be, right? That's one of the litmus tests is, one of joining a company should be to really deeply understand their culture and say, am I a good fit? You know, we tell the story in the new book that I've written of this mid-sized company where the CEO interviewed every single person and would say to them, "This is going to be the best job you ever had in your life, or it's going to be the worst job you ever had in your life." And that was culture, the culture of the organization.
So, if people want to pre-order your book, which I think comes out later this year, what's the book? How can they find it on Amazon?
Thanks, Matt, for that layup question. I like that a lot. So the book is called Soul of Strategy, Building Customer-Centric Organizations. And it's available to pre-order on Amazon today. So the soul of strategy, building the customer-centered organization. What's interesting about that book is it makes the argument that strategy was very competitive focused back when Porter was writing in the 80s and 90s. The last 20 years has been very what's called resource-based view of the firm. Both those views have not put the customer at the center of strategy. And this book says it's all wrong. At the end of the day, the litmus test for success is the customer. So everything should start with the customer from a strategy perspective, and then worry about customers and worry about capabilities after that. That's a second order issue.
Interesting. Well, I definitely look forward to reading your book and doing another review of your new book and having you back on the podcast in the future to talk about it.
Anytime, anytime. Very happy to do that. I've enjoyed the conversation.
I'd love to get your take on something. I recently had a guest, Ken Favreau. I don't know if you know Ken. He was a partner of mine at Booz and Company when I led the New York office. He was a senior partner in the New York office. Was the CEO of Maricon, and then Booz acquired brought them into a number of folks in Maricon over. And then he left after PwC acquired Booz, and he's now doing like board work and independent consulting. And he's also the head of strategy for an AI data business called Barra.ai. Great mentor of mine. And he wrote a book called Real Strategy, which is provocative. And the question is, what's not real strategy, right? And his point of view, just to kind of cut to the chase, is that it's only a real strategy if it addresses three questions around who, why, and what. And I think the take here is that he's saying that if you have a mission, vision, and purpose, but don't answer these questions, you actually don't have a strategy. Now, I'm torn on this. I think he's right that you need to answer those questions. I think what but by the same token, if you have a strategy but don't have a clear mission, vision, and purpose, I don't think you can have a good strategy. I don't think you can have a strategy that's emotionally engaging for your organization and its role in society. So, like, I think they're both true. You need a mission, vision, and purpose the way that you define them in order for your organization to reach its potential and evoke the right emotional connection with your customers and employees. Um, get that emotional connection, not just rational compliance, and which is what culture is about, is getting that emotional connection. But I'd love to get your thoughts on his comment that you can't have a real strategy without those.
Yeah, it's a really meaty question, right? So my view is, it sounds like it's similar to yours. Mission, vision, and purpose sets the broad agenda for the company. What business are we in? Where do we want to take that business over the next 5 years? How do we know if it's successful? And then, what's the purpose of what we're trying to do? Those are very broad ideas. And actually, you point that out in your book review. These are broad ideas, and they are, right? And the good news in the book, we say, here are the criteria to judge these. So we actually make it somewhat concrete. But my view is that still leaves room for setting strategy. And for setting strategy, it's the set of very concrete choices that a firm makes to gain competitive advantage. And typically those choices are in two areas. One is the where to play area. So what market segments, what markets, what geographies, what's that, all the where to play questions. And then the how to win questions, which is really about the value proposition and building the value chain to kind of deliver that value proposition. So I always think about those two broad questions around the where to play and the how to win. And answering those sets of questions gives you the strategy, in my judgment.
That makes sense. So, you still need the mission, vision, and purpose to create that, you know, um, lasting, more impactful view. Ken calls this like, what is the big idea of the business still valid, right? Do you need to revisit that or refresh that? It sounds like you guys are aligned on that. I won't put you more on the hot seat without giving you the opportunity to read his book or watch the podcast. It would be
Okay,
unfair.
great, great. I like that, Matt. Next time we get together for my new book, I will have read that book and be ready to answer your follow-on
Yeah,
question.
and I'm encouraging Ken to read your book as well. I have actually. And by the way, I've been involved, both in my past life and more recent work. More recently, I focused on like leveraging how does customer experience ladder up to the right mission, vision, and purpose. It has to be aligned to it. And often my work will expose the need to work further on the mission, vision, and purpose because it's hard to build a CX that's congruent with a mission if you don't have a clear mission. And then it's actually not a really good thing if you have people in the organization trying to develop a CX mission where there's no alignment with the senior leadership about what the real mission of the organization. So sometimes my work on culture and CX strategy actually exposes need to work. And I've started to look at your book now to like when I people ask me what was the mission good, I'll look at your book and say, well, what does Bernie say about a good mission?
And I think, it's kind of funny. I thought a lot about it, about what those criteria are going to be. And in part because I saw so many mission statements that are so poorly done, you know, and we're in the business of serving customers. Okay, that's really helpful. What other business? Like, it's like we're in the business to really deliver shareholder value. Well, that really tells me a lot about who you are. The way lots of times I describe it is if you found the mission statement, on a sheet of paper with no company logo or anything, but just found a sheet of paper on the floor, could you tell me who the company is? That's a good mission statement, right? So rarely do you meet those tests. In fact, it was hard in writing the book to come up with mission statements that pass the 5 criteria that I identified in the book. One of which is you want to have a mission statement that's focused on customer benefits, not on the products and technologies you deliver, because product technologies are constantly changing. But the underlying benefit, hopefully, is one that lasts for decades, right? Of what you might be looking for, right? So it's not easy to craft really, really good mission statements. Last point is, so I go into an organization and I ask 100 people, what's your mission statement? And 10 people say here it is. That's a very bad story. It means the mission's irrelevant, right? It's irrelevant, completely irrelevant. Whereas going back to my Mars example, if I say what's your purpose, every single person you talk to will say better world for pets.
So I'm going to take that one step further, and hopefully you will think this is fair, uh, which is if you have the mission, vision, purpose, and the values of the organization clearly laid out, and I think you should. I think your book makes a really compelling case for that. Um, it's also important to articulate clarity on the specific behaviors you want. Now, the challenge here is you want to leave room for employees to interpret the behaviors themselves. So if you get too prescriptive about behaviors, it's actually limiting. But what's your thought on clarity on enumerated behaviors versus leaving that open?
So, a couple thoughts about that. And I'll make it really concrete. And you'll love this story, Matt. So, Virginia, who was my PhD student, being a PhD student is a difficult job because you are at some point after you pass all your qualifying exams, you have a year, 2 or 3 to write a dissertation. And lots of times people get lost in the ambiguity of the whole thing. So she had this idea. She's going to write about Confucianism and the intersection of Confucianism thinking with Drucker. So she spent at least 6 months, and I feel incredibly guilty about this, reading and reading and reading Confucian's work and trying to figure out the intersection between Confucianism and Drucker. And one day she comes into my office and I said, "How's it going, Virginia?" And I could see she was just not in a good mental health state. And I said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. At the end of the day, it's behavior that matters. So what we're going to do is we're going to isolate 10 or 15 or 20 of Confucianism's core principles as to what we think leading a virtuous life, for example, or having rituals guide what you do, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to read his writing, we're going to isolate the principle, and then what I want you to do is put together behavior anchors. So that principle of leading a virtuous life, what is the set of behaviors would score a 1 for somebody? What are the score behaviors that score a 5? What are the behaviors that score a 10? And that way, once we isolate these, we can go into companies and say, hey, on virtue, here's a 1 to 10 point scale. You, Matt, can you score yourself, in terms of where you think you fit on Confucianism's values based on the behaviors you engaged in? So I think behaviors are absolutely critical. And for Virginia, it was a breakthrough. It gave her enormous relief because then we isolated a handful of principles that became part of the book and isolated the behaviors. So it made it very tangible as opposed to abstract. One of the critiques of Confucianism is that it's very philosophical and very high level, and it's hard to put into practice. And so what we're doing with Virginia was to actually put into practice the ideas through the behaviors of individuals. And so that's the way we made it concrete.
I love that. I don't like to have like prescriptive off the shelf behaviors. I think that it's good to discover them and develop them. And like Ken says in our podcast, that like strategies are like children. You love them because you create them, right? So like people embrace what they help create. So I think it's important when you translate the mission, vision, purpose, and values into behaviors that you create the list and not just take someone else's published list. Um, but I do think that it's important to, for a number of reasons today, to get clarity on the behaviors. And what I like to do is work with the companies to come up with the 10 to 20 behaviors that bring your MVP and values to life. Um, and then think about what emotions are we evoking? Like behavior of the peaks in the customer journey, same's true of employee journeys, but the peaks in the customer journey where they're higher, they're meaningful and memorable, that's where emotion is highest. And it's behavior that actually creates that emotional peak. So if you identify the emotions you want in the journey and the behaviors from the employees that get you that, then you can think about management systems to create that behavior, whether it's hiring or rituals or storytelling or rewards, or you can also start aligning your customer listening with AI to look for the behaviors now. If you have a data signal like a recorded call or emails or meetings, you got to be careful not to get creepy. But there are things you can do today beyond surveys to start actually looking for behavior adoption. Um, and that's something you can do now. And so a lot of my focus is on helping identify that connection, like what are the emotions you want in the journey? What are the behaviors you want? And then evolving your training and customer listening to reinforce behavior adoption.
I really like that a lot. It's kind of interesting. The classical model of thinking about understanding consumers in the marketplace, the classical model is one that looks at 3 dimensions: cognition, affect, and behavior. And they say you got to kind of, if you're really trying to understand customers at a very deep level, you have to understand how they think. You have to understand what their emotions are, what the affect is with it, and you have to understand their behavior, right? So it has three different kind of levels of analysis, and depending upon how you structure it, one of those may be more dominant than the other, right? But I think emotion is also very consistent with Drucker, because Drucker said you hire the whole person. And by that he meant we're all human beings, right? We have strengths, we have weaknesses, we have emotions, we have care abouts, we have concerns, we have an attitude, right? You're bringing the whole person, right? And so therefore you get strengths and weaknesses. And so therefore you have to accommodate that. And you have to kind of think about that, and that he was there, the very earliest proponent of saying, listen, we all have strengths and weaknesses, drive your strengths, think about your strengths, put yourself in positions where you can, in a role. In fact, he said, role assignment is the most important thing you can do in structuring an organization. That is putting people in the right roles where they can excel. And you're basically talking about match of their skill set, their strengths, what they want to do developmentally into that particular role. But I think going back to the more general point, you have to look at that as the whole person, right? And with that person, you get all this stuff, right? Including emotion, which is very important to leverage, right? In terms of the work.
I've loved our conversation. It's really sparked a lot of great ideas for me, Bernie. I'm sure you have for the audience too. One last question, if I could, is I mentioned I reviewed your book. I love doing book reviews. I do one every month, which I include in our newsletter and on our website. What are your favorite books? What's influenced you?
I'm going to make one plug for anybody who enjoyed our conversation and wants to know more about Drucker. My book I'd recommend from Drucker is a 1954 book called The Practice of Management. It was the very first, it was when he tried to pull together the field of management for the very first time in a holistic, general way. And he took it from levels of what individuals do to what an organization does to ultimately what are the responsibilities of a management team for a functioning society. So he in this book, he laid out kind of a lot of you can see the threads of that 54 book come up in his 67 book and his book on management for 21st century and so forth. So if I'm plugging one Drucker book, it's the 1954 Practice of Management. Um, from the so there's kind of interesting questions about books, like business books versus sort of fiction, nonfiction, and so forth, right? So there's lots of different kind of ways we can kind of take the conversation. From a business book perspective, um, there's an interesting book called Customers for Life by Jagdish Sheth, and I'm forgetting his co-author right now. Customers for Life.
Andrew Sobel used to use that phrase a lot. He did training,
Yeah,
and he always used the
yeah,
phrase "customers for life." Maybe he
yeah,
got it from Jack.
yeah. And so it's a fun little book. It's a simple little book. It's easy to kind of get your hands around, but it's a kind of an interesting perspective. Colleagues at IMD, where I spent time as a visiting professor in Switzerland. Um, there's a recent book called Customer Copernicus as the title. And it's a fun little read around thinking about value propositions, about what customers are kind of thinking about. So those would be two books that are within the last 10 years I thought were, interesting, provocative reads in the world of business. So those would be things that I might suggest as a reading list.
Awesome. Those are great. Bernie, if folks wanted to get in touch with you, is LinkedIn the best way or some other?
LinkedIn's great. The other way is I'm very quick to respond on my email out of Claremont Graduate University. So it's bernie.jaworski at CGU, Claremont Graduate University.edu. And love to hear from people about their thinking.
Thanks so much for your time today. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you. I'm happy to come back for the next book too. Thanks again.
Let's do it.